is them who stuck the money in their pocket and wanted more and more and more. So Dave, thank you very much. Would you like to speak to the meeting?
Well, thanks very much, Judy, and thanks to everyone who's come out tonight and has Lee finished. I think it is an excellent turnout. Thanks for coming. Hopefully by the end of the meeting you'll be convinced to get involved and to help us in the election campaign which we're here to talk about tonight. And as Judy began her contribution, I'll remind you there are 70 days from now to the general election. 1,673 hours till polls open. I've actually got the figure in seconds if you're really interested. There's a website you can go on, it's a fraction over 6 million seconds to go. That makes a little bit light, obviously, what is a crucial election. Not just in terms of passing judgment on 5 years of a coalition government and what we've heard already from several speakers about the things that they've done in that last 5 years, but because, and it's not to put too great a point on it, it marks for me the beginnings of major political change in this country. Now, in some senses, you might say that's daft, because I'm going to go on to say how very little is going to change, because all the parties have similar policies and similar programmes. But what it marks is that at the end of the Second World War, in the 50s and the 60s, 1950s in particular, politics in this country was defined by two parties, Labour and Tory. And 97% of people who went to vote in elections in the 1950s picked one of them two parties. On May the 7th, when the elections take place, general and local, it will probably be less than 60% of people voting will pick one of those two main parties. Of those eligible to vote, of the whole electorate, adult population in the country, it will be much, much less than that. In other words, well over a third of the population of this country now don't believe that two main parties have got the answer to people's problems and are casting around for some form of alternative. Now, one of the main reasons for that is the widespread feeling that all politicians are the same. And with Malcolm Rifkind and Jack Straw just proving it again in the last 48 hours, they're reinforcing that feeling in people's minds. But it's the common agenda you get. If you put the telly on, you put Newsnight on, you put the news on, a young politician comes on. It's not until they put a name and a party label underneath that name on the telly you can say with any confidence which party they're from, because they're selling you exactly the same message, whether it's Tory, Liberal Democrat, Labour, or even, as I'll go on to mention, UKIP and other parties as well. Now, we're likely to get a close result on May the 7th. We're not going to get one party, I don't think, forming a government. There's going to be another mix of parties after the May the 7th, like there's been a coalition taking place over the last 5 years. But whatever the mix is, there'll be a seamless continuity of policies. The Institute of Fiscal Studies has looked at the policies of the main parties and reckoned that 40% of the cuts they've talked about have taken place so far in this Parliament. There's another 60% to come in the next 5 years. In other words, an even bigger amount of austerity than we've had so far. One or two of us here went to one of the consultation meetings that the City Council held before they took the vote yesterday, which I'll come back to in a minute, about the cuts in the community centres, the libraries, the children's centres, the family centres, and so on. And at that consultation meeting, the Director of Finance, Chris West, was asked why it was that he brought forward a report to yesterday's council meeting. This was back in January, the consultation meeting took place, which recommended £50 million worth of cuts over 5 years, 15 million starting from the vote yesterday. Surely there's a general election taking place on May the 7th. Doesn't it matter who wins that election? Couldn't you be coming back in a year's time with a different type of report for what the council had to do? And he said no. He'd gone through in detail the financial plans of the main parties likely to be in the next Parliament, principally Labour and Tory, and there was no fundamental difference between them. Therefore, what he was recommending of a 3-year cuts programme of £50 million stood whoever won the election on May the 7th. So that means more cuts in essential council services. If you're a council worker, it means your wages being held below price rises. For some in this city, that has been, correct me if I'm wrong now, I think we can go back to almost 8 to 10 years. There are some council workers now who've not had a pay rise, not just because of the freezing of wages, because of single status and that which preceded it in many cases. For those who use council services, the charges are going to go up. The prices that you have to pay for certain services will increase unless we do something about it. Now, there'll be all sorts of attempts in the next few weeks to talk up the prospects of the general election, but for most ordinary people, the last 5 years have been an unmitigated disaster, and the next 5 are likely to be the same. Firstly, wages. Wages now 10% lower than they were at the beginning of the Parliament. There's an increasing number of people again who are turning to credit cards in order to meet essential bills. We've had 43 reforms in welfare and social security, and now you've got the main two parties vying with each other as to who can promise to be tougher on welfare recipients in the next Parliament. And regretful, I'm saying, it looks like Labour is winning that argument at the moment. We've got 16 food banks in this city. I came here 43 years ago, the richest working class city in Britain. They measured wage claims throughout Britain from what the Coventry two-room rate was in our factories. Richest working class city in the country. And now we've got 16 food banks for people who can't get from one end of the week to the rest without coming for some sort of charity in a plastic bag. The 5th or 6th richest country on the planet has already been said, and 1 million people in our country nationally are relying on food banks. And it's not a good part of a century to be born in if you're young. I mean, I'm not going to pick on Jordan in particular because he's young, he's at Foxford and his age and so on, but his generation, one or two others in the audience not too dissimilar ages. Well, I was growing up in the 50s and the 60s, and I've told this story brief before, so this one will be brief. Dad, 43 years as a steel worker, Mum did a bit of cleaning. But by and large, in the 50s and 60s, one working class wage got you by. You might not got everything you wanted, but you could get by. We're now, according to the Financial Times a couple of days ago, a nation of second job grafters. Not only does a working class family need 2 incomes to come in, but working class people, almost 2 million of them, can't manage on one job. They're having to do 2 and in some cases 3 jobs to try and make enough to pay those essential bills. That's the future for young people in this country. 1.8 million people on 0-hour contracts don't even know whether there's going to be a full wage at the end of the week. They go through higher education. £50,000 at the end of it for a 3-year bill to go to university. Labour, of course, being the generous party it is, has promised that if they get elected, it'll only be £40,000 that those young people will have to pay. Where do you get the money for a mortgage if you're servicing a £40,000 debt? Because the house prices, 2.5, 3 times my wage when I was looking for somewhere, Jane and I were looking for somewhere to buy 30 odd years ago. Now for young people, 6, 7, 8 times an average wage in order to get, even if you can get the mortgage to get on the housing ladder itself. This could be easily the first generation since the Second World War which is going to be worse off than its parents' generation unless we do something about it. The safety net of councils is disappearing. £15 million of cuts yesterday. They've promised to delay for up to a year the closures of libraries. Not to not close the libraries, but to delay for up to a year the consultation. And while they're doing that, of course, they've found... Having said, by the way, and I haven't got time to go into all this tonight about how we've argued in recent weeks that with £81 million worth of reserves in the City Council budget, it should have been possible to find a few £1,000,000 to delay the implementation of the cuts. The council managed to find last night £500,000 for what it calls a transition fund, which is essentially a marketing exercise to try and find volunteers over the next 12 months to run those libraries or to take over the running of community centres, children's centres and the rest. They did find some other money for children's services, which they said wasn't available only months ago. But also they're carrying on with the closure of the centres I've mentioned, with a reduction in street cleaning, with park maintenance, 1,000 more jobs to go from the council. And it doesn't matter whether those cuts are planned in Westminster carried out enthusiastically by Tories or UKIP councillors, or with a heavy heart by Labour councillors, Lib Dem councillors, or even Green councillors. The effect is still the same. Those cuts, at the end of the day, as Nicky has outlined, will have an effect on children and families, which will mar their futures completely. And we're not all in it together, like they've been telling us. Over that same 5 years that the coalition have been in, and we've had all the problems that I've briefly outlined, the richest 1,000 families in this country have seen their wealth double, from £250 billion to over £500 billion in a 5-year period. Now, part of that growth, particularly in finance, has been because of the restoration of bonuses. Remember, the bankers and the finance industry in general, and the tops of the people in that industry in particular, brought this country to its knees in 2008 by their gambling and their speculation, triggering the recession that began in 2008. And if you saw that programme, The Rich and Us, on BBC last month, how did it start out, that two-part programme? They'd gone to the Office of National Statistics and other places and analysed what's happened over the last 7 years. Two things. One, there's been an £80 billion cut in essential public services, the freezing of benefits, the freezing of allowances, the cuts in wages, the services, the things we've mentioned already. And on the other hand, there's been a total in the banking and finance industry since 2008 of bonus payments to the top of that industry of £80 billion. In other words, every little bit of pain that working class families have gone through over the last 7 or 8 years has been absolutely equally translated into the protection from pain of the richest within society, particularly within the banking system. So it's not we're a poor country. It's not that we can't afford to heat everybody's house, or pay for all the young people to have somewhere decent to live, or to have wages, decent conditions in employment, to clothe or feed a family, to make sure every family has a holiday. It's not that we can't afford to do those things, it's that the wealth we do have in this country is in the wrong hands. A tiny number of multi-millionaires at the top of society, whilst the rest of people suffer. Now, we're not alone in this room in thinking that's wrong. Millions of people think that politicians are not on the same planet as them. They think that at best politicians ignore them or take them for granted. At worst, they actually plan to make sure that ordinary working class people pay for that crisis. Now, to a certain extent, that's not new. In the past, however, the Liberal Democrats, and I would argue now the Greens to a certain extent, have been consciously used by the press in between elections to soak up the disaffection from one particular government so it doesn't automatically translate to the other party. A bit like a shock absorber in a car. And we're in a different political period now. We've got multi-millionaires pouring money into a far-right political party, UKIP itself, which is taking the anger of working people and harnessing that disaffection with austerity, with establishment politicians in general, with falling incomes, with rising inequality, and instead of directing it towards the real culprits within society, are misdirecting it towards those recent arrivals to these shores. Now, UKIP is not the anti-establishment party that it's been portrayed to be. As has already been mentioned, it's led by a publicly schooled ex-Tory, ex-banker. It's staffed by people who worship Mrs Thatcher, and it's funded by multi-millionaires who think the Tories have gone soft. UKIP is a dangerous political formation in this country, very similar to other countries like France and Austria, where far-right politics have begun to get a grip. And we have to expose both its racism, but also answer the fears that working class people have, which makes them think that UKIP is some sort of alternative solution. Let me just give one example of that, and that's housing. The last 10 or 15 years in this city, we've had over 20,000 people at any one time who are on the housing waiting list. Now, our population in the last 18 months has grown by about 8 or 9,000. Students, and migrant workers being the two main areas that the additional people have come from. Over that same 10 or 12 year period, when we've had that 20,000 waiting list and we've had an increase in the local population, the target for Coventry City Council for the building of affordable homes has been 300 a year, and they've not been meeting that target. So you can understand, if you've got people who've been on that housing waiting list for years, and I managed to drag out the council almost in my last meeting 3 years ago, that the person who waited the longest on the Coventry housing waiting list, who'd been allocated a property, I think it was in 2011, had joined the Coventry waiting list in 1974. Nearly 40 years of waiting for a property. Now you can understand, if working class people are waiting that long for somewhere decent to live in, and somebody comes along and points the finger at somebody who's only been here a year or two, they can channel that anger in a direction which in my view is a poisonous direction. What we would put forward to address those fears of working class people is, let's start by what housing is needed in this city, and it is tens of thousands. Let's develop a plan, both for the empty homes in this city, but also the new build of homes that we need. Let's look at the skill base of people who used to work and build houses who were denied the chance to work. Let's look at the billions of pounds that's flooding around the finance industry. Let's draw up a rational plan for building of the homes, for employing the people, of giving apprenticeships, and let's give it a target of 5 years to achieve it. Now, put forward things like that, as TUSC does, and the socialists, particularly within TUSC, argue for, and you can see how that illustrates why we need a new type of political force in this city. One that deals with the real problems that are affecting working people with rational socialist solutions. And that's why, as Lee said, Bob Crow, the late General Secretary of the Transport Union, the RMT, set us up as a coalition of trade unionists, of socialists, anti-cuts campaigners, to challenge the establishment parties at the ballot box. And we're hoping this May to make a bit of a mark in that political process. We need to stand over 100 parliamentary candidates in order to get party political broadcasts during the election period in Wales, in Scotland and in England. And as of last week, we now have 92 general election candidates with deposits set aside and ready, and with names ready to go forward in the nominating procedure. I reckon by this time, in certainly 2 weeks' time, we will have passed the 100 mark. So for the first time for many, many years, there will be an anti-austerity message going out in the party political broadcasts of the general election. We're going to take it further than that. We want to stand over 1,000 anti-cuts council candidates, because whatever happens in the election for Parliament on May the 7th, at best you're going to get a change of management style when it comes to May the 8th. The policies are going to continue. What we need on this council is not the spineless councillors we have at the moment. We need good shop stewards with backbone, that when they come and say, we're shutting your library, they say, no you're not. And I'm going to get 200 people from my community outside this council house tomorrow morning, make sure you're not going to shut my library, or my community centre, or the children's centre, or the family centre, or the other essential public services. Now, that was the spirit of Labour in the past. I haven't got the time to go through it tonight, but you read about Poplar in the 1920s, now Tower Hamlets in London. You read about Clay Cross in Derbyshire in the 1970s. You read about Liverpool and Lambeth in the mid-1980s. We used to have councils of councillors that would stand up to the Tories of the day. Now we've only got individual councillors. But there are some. There are a few councillors in Southampton, in Warrington, in Hull, in Leicester, and where those councillors have stood up, Labour's immediately expelled them from the party, and they've had nowhere else to go but to come and join this coalition. We're on about 8 or 10 councillors in the last year that have joined us in that particular way. So we'll get our broadcast, but those broadcasts will come very late in the campaign. They'll be in the last couple of weeks of the election campaign. More importantly is that once you pass that threshold to qualify for broadcasts, then the BBC, who acts on behalf of all the broadcast media, cannot legally exclude the politics of anti-austerity from other areas of election coverage. So, for example, there will be 3 election debates, live debates, on BBC CWR. an hour each. And we have been asked to supply a TUSC candidate from the Neaton, from North Warwickshire, and from Coventry North East, that's Nicky at the end there, for one of each of those debates. Up and down the country, in debates on radio and on regional TV, the fact that we can reach that threshold of candidates mean we can start getting earlier into the election campaign the arguments of anti-austerity. What I want to finish with is now to give a little flavour of the positives that we're going to be putting forward in this campaign. We'll spend all night saying what's wrong with the Tories Lib Dem coalition, what's wrong with capitalism, why we need in general a socialist solution to those matters. Let's just give a flavour of some of the ideas that any one of which, if you were fired up by it, you could help us by joining in this campaign and pushing forward a stronger campaign on. And the reason, I do finish with one last example of why it's so necessary. I said earlier on that in the next Parliament all the main parties have agreed that budget cuts are necessary, and last month there was a cast iron example of that. George Osborne, the Chancellor, brought forward a thing called the Charter for Budget Responsibility, and it codifies for the next Parliament the legal requirement to balance the books in Parliament. That means making another an extra £30 billion worth of cuts in public spending so that that money can be used to shore up the bankers' bonuses and their system. And a vote was taken on that, an extra £30 billion. 515 MPs of all parties voted in favour of it, 18 voted against. Of that 18, there were only 5 Labour MPs in the whole country who thought it was a bad idea to have another £30 billion worth of cuts on top of all the cuts that have already been announced by the government. So we need to build up an opposition to that, and it can't just come by saying what's wrong. It starts to give some inspiration to people about what could be changed and what could be put right. So here are those examples. Firstly, we will be the hardest campaigners in this election for a 50% increase in the national minimum wage to £10 an hour, so that work pays without recourse to means-tested benefits. And what that means at the moment, the national minimum wage is £6.50 an hour, and if you work a 40-hour week, then you're talking a couple of £100 a week. Every pound you earn extra in a week, you lose housing benefit, council tax benefit, child tax credit and other mean-tested benefits on top of the extra tax and national insurance that you pay of 80p in the pound. So a low-paid worker on the basic national minimum wage loses 80p for every extra pound they work over for. That has two effects. Firstly, it keeps people in low pay, because even if you work harder, you don't see that money yourself. And secondly, it's a direct subsidy to low-paying bosses who can get away with paying low wages, knowing that your taxes, through the general taxation system, comes back to subsidise the wages of the low-paid. It's not till you get to £10 an hour or above that you start paying the same normal tax and national insurance rate as anybody else pays in any other job. Secondly, we will end zero-hour contracts and introduce full employment rights from day one of employment. Alongside the house building I mentioned earlier on, we're going to bring in compulsory registration for private landlords and a cap on rents, two things which afflict people in the private rented sector in this and other cities. We fight for the restoration of funds for local councils, so once again local services, essential local services, can be properly publicly provided. We'd not only abolish the bedroom tax, and some of our candidates in this election have been the strongest campaigners in the city against evictions and the threat of evictions brought about by the bedroom tax, but we've reversed cuts to benefits and increased pensions so that they restore the real value of the pension itself. To pay for that and other similar demands to it, We've campaigned for a serious increase in the taxation on the rich and the end to the avoidance and evasion by wealthy individuals and corporations who presently in this country get away with something like £120 billion a year by not paying the proper rates of tax which they should do. And finally, we would bring back into public ownership the privatised utilities and services of rail, gas, water and electricity. We'd renationalise the NHS so that again health genuinely becomes free, abolishing the parking charges up at Walsgrave, getting rid of prescription charges and bringing drug companies into a properly genuine, fully publicly owned health service as well, and build a society that began to be run and organised for the needs of ordinary working class people and their families. Now, just imagine if elements of that had been on Question Time 29 times in the last 10 years, in the same way as Nigel Farage has been given a platform 29 times in the last 10 years, even before he had a single MP in Parliament. Now, we know what the pressures are going to be. We know the difficulty it is breaking through a first-past-the-post system when you've got millions of pounds being poured into the big parties and the resources we have are so stretched. Nevertheless, even though there will be some who would agree with us but may end up voting in the national election for somebody who they think perhaps can beat the Tories and give a change of government, we're at the beginning of a journey. And this is the point I want to finish on, to show you that all sorts of things are possible. UKIP started in 1992. In the first 10 years it stood in 25 by-elections. It averaged 1.7% in its first 10 years of existence. Syriza in Greece was started in 2004 as a coalition not dissimilar from the coalition we have in this TUSC organisation here tonight. In 2004 it got 3.3% in the elections. In 2010, 6 years later, it got 4.6% in the elections. This year, it got over 35% in the elections, and there is now a left-wing government in Greece itself. Now, I'm not saying that if you can help us build the trade unionists and socialist coalition, that TUSC is going to follow a linear path in exactly the same way as anybody else has done in Greece or anywhere else. But we can begin to change the terms of the debate in this election. We can force onto the agenda the real lives of working class children, like Nikki spoke about, the real anguish of those faced over a Christmas period with redundancies, like Lee spoke about, the sacrifice of public sector workers like Nick spoke about, told to pay more for a pension that they're going to get less out. We can bring the reality of working class lives into this election, providing we build not just an electoral alternative, but a vehicle for working class people, a new political party that's rooted in the organisations and the communities of the working class of Coventry itself. Now, if you'd like to help us take those first steps tonight, be at the beginning of a little bit of history. Help us in this election, but help us build in Coventry and elsewhere a new socialist force for working people. Thanks very much for listening.